You're a detective, and a pretty good one. You've solved some of the county's greatest mysteries. The Green Shadow Killer, the case of the headless carriage driver. But right now, you're just waking up. It's Friday morning on a brisk autumn day, a quiet one by your standards. You walk into your office at 8:45, about the same time as usual. You go through some paperwork from a recent bank robbery. Nothing too interesting. At 9:25, the phone rings. You pick up the phone only to hear a voice, a familiar voice, a friendly voice. After some bland and unfulfilling pleasantries, the answer comes to you like a light. It's Mr. DeWitt, a local steel magnate, and one of Nova Scotia's richest men. You solved a case for him a year or two ago. A relatively challenging case, if your memory serves you well. His foreman was paid off by his biggest competitor to sabotage the operation, resulting in murder.
Ah, my good sir. I'm glad to hear your voice again. I'm forever grateful to you for helping me solve that problem I had last year. You see, I never got the chance to formally thank you. I'm hosting a get-together on Armstrong Island this weekend, and I'd like to invite you. Don't worry about dressing too formal. It's just a couple of close business partners and family. Meet me at the docks tomorrow at, say, 2. Please, it's the least I can do to repay you.
It doesn't look like you have much choice. You go about your day as usual. Today's a quiet day. Nobody's been murdered or severely injured. There was a bar fight at about 1:30, but that got cleaned up rather quick. The next day, you take a carriage to the docks to meet Mr. DeWitt. He's there alone. A bit suspicious for a get-together, but it's probably nothing. He sees you and lights up.
I knew you'd show up. I knew it. Somehow I just knew. We've got a special evening planned. The others are already there.
You hop onto a small boat big enough for a dozen or so people. You make small talk, but you don't have a lot in common. You're still friendly to him, and he's still grateful to you, so you both make an effort. You're looking forward to a get-together of his standards, but you're worried it will entail a lot of small talk and egocentric businessmen. The cold air and frigid ocean make you tighten your coat even tighter. After 15 minutes or so, you reach an island, a small rocky island, Armstrong Island. You get off with Mr. DeWitt and salute the driver of the boat goodbye. You climb up a small set of wide stone steps until you reach a manor atop the hill. It's nicer than most people's homes, but to the DeWitts, it's a vacation home. Is that who I think it is? Boy, am I glad to see you. Father, if there's one thing I can't argue with you about, it's your taste in guests. That's Thomas DeWitt, son of Mr. DeWitt, about 20 or so. He's always been a jovial fellow, and for whatever reason, seems to admire you and your work as a detective.
Tom, show him around. I have some business to discuss with Mr. Gillies.
You begin walking around the side of the house. There's a lovely garden overlooking the water. Thomas is keen on talking. Detective, ever since we've met, I've been so intrigued with your methods. How you find the clues and catch the criminal. It's so exciting. In fact, I'm considering becoming a copper myself. I've become a tad bored with our lifestyle that I'm considering something more daring, more adventurous. Out of context, this might seem inspiring, but given the facts, it seems less and less so. Thomas DeWitt may be a kind and jolly young man, but he has never lifted as much as a finger in his entire life. It's quite challenging for you to envision him rounding up drunks or patrolling the less desirable parts of town. Nonetheless, you don't want to crush his spirit, and you decide not to dispute it. As the two of you walk, you approach two men sitting in chairs on the garden patio. On your left is, of course, my brother, James Jr., whom you know from our time together, and on the right is John Jacob Brisebois, a business associate of my father's.
A pleasure to see you again, Detective.
Hi, John Jacob Brisebois. I've heard all about you from Tommy here. Have you heard about the deal between Jimmy Sr. and myself? We're going to expand his steel empire to the lovely state of Massachusetts, where steel is high in demand. But enough about me, Detective. You look thirsty. Wolf, could you fetch our good detective here a whiskey?
You look behind you to see a tall, slim, pale man with combed-back, slick black hair standing there idly with a grey rag in his hand. Right away, sir. Don't let Father know we have whiskey. You know how he is at these things. He can't refuse a drink. We'll try and keep him sober until dinner. You continue to make small talk for the rest of the afternoon. You hardly touch your whiskey. You are a detective. You like to keep your mind as sharp as you possibly can. As the sun begins to make its way closer to the horizon and the discussion begins to wane, your party of 4 in the garden make their way into the house. You enter the main floor of the house only to see Mr. Wolf the butler dusting the floors. You haven't seen Mr. DeWitt since you first arrived. Strange, but it is a big house. Perhaps they're in his study, or down by the water. As a group, you're about to enter the parlor for another discussion about politics, business, or something of the sort, when you hear a thump, and then some indiscernible yelling. After a brief second of trying to listen for more, you begin a hasty walk up the stairs. But before you get to the 5th step, Mr. DeWitt and Mr. Gillies walk down the steps. But something seems a little off. You've never seen Mr. Gillies before, but he looks frustrated at something, and Mr. DeWitt looks like a fright. His hair is messy, and his jacket has been folded and creased near the shoulders. James Jr. tries to bring it up, but James Sr. changes the subject by asking Mr. Wolf to start dinner. Dinner is delicious, but a bit too upscale for your liking, but who are you to complain? Mr. DeWitt, who began dinner quietly, now begins to regain his dominance. As he begins to speak, you notice the wind picking up outside, and the waves crashing against the rocks.
My good detective, I forgot to tell you, it's poker tonight. But not to worry, I've covered your buy-in.
You have no idea how long this is going to last, but that's not your concern. You don't want to be a bad guest. As dinner wraps up, you make your way down to the card room and sit around a table covered in green fabric. As everyone finally sits down and stops chattering, you hear the crashing of the waves increase in intensity.
Well, are we going to sit around and look at each other, or are we going to play some cards?
Don't act so confident, Father. After last time, you're going down.
Spoken like a true DeWitt. Let's play.
Mr. DeWitt begins to shuffle the cards and deals them to the players. Tommy wins the first pot, as well as the second. Neither of them were very big. The third pot was rather large and was taken by Mr. Brisebois. After some time, the game develops into something of a 3-way battle between Mr. Brisebois and the 2 James DeWitts. You, Tommy, and Mr. Gillies seem to always tag along behind. There are times in the game you forget that this is real money they're playing with, that you're playing with. You don't know how much, but you're certain it's not nickels and dimes like at the bars in town. As the waves continue to crash on the rocks, Mr. DeWitt tells a joke and the table roars in laughter. It's somewhat funny, so you join in the raucous laughter. Wolf, fetch me a brandy, please.
Make that 2. Make that 3, Wolf. Thanks.
Wolf hastily brings back a tray of 3 glasses of brandy and places them next to Mr. DeWitt, Tommy, and Brisebois, all while the next hand develops. The bets are higher than ever. Even you seem to have a good hand, but eventually you can't go any further. Mr. DeWitt takes a sip of his brandy.
All in.
J.J. Brisebois sits in an asymmetrical position with his legs crossed and takes a sip of his brandy. After what seems like 30 seconds, he replies.
I call.
Mr. DeWitt reveals his cards.
Flush.
He continues to laugh as he reaches over to grab the massive pile of chips in the center of the table. Mr. Brisebois moves his head forward and reveals his cards.
Full house.
A delayed smirk grows on the face of Mr. Brisebois. Mr. DeWitt's laugh turns into a grunt, and then turns into complete silence. His face falls into the poker chips in front of him.
Come on, Jimmy, it's just a game.
Mr. Brisebois gets up and tries to move Mr. DeWitt's arms and head from the table.
He's dead. He's dead. Oh no.
You ask everyone to remain calm and that you will be in charge of the investigation. You ask everyone to stay on the island, but judging by the conditions outside, that shouldn't be a problem. Before anything can be tampered with, you trust your instincts and go right for the drink. You waft its smell, and over the strong smell of brandy, it gives off a hint of bitter almonds. Most people would either never notice it or understand it. But you're a detective, and you know exactly what this is. This is the smell of cyanide. Mr. DeWitt was poisoned, and you announce it to the room. But there's something else. Mr. Brisebois also took a sip of brandy, meaning the whole bottle couldn't have been poisoned, just Mr. DeWitt's glass. That's a problem you don't have time to solve. Right now you need to ask some questions while the iron is still hot. Most people either sit down to absorb the shock or begin speculating with others. But at this particular moment in time, there's only one person you want to talk to. One person you know had a disagreement with Mr. DeWitt. Mr. Gillies. You pull him aside and he begins to get defensive.
Detective, I'm more than happy to answer any questions about Mr. DeWitt, but I will not tolerate any implications that I, Grant C. Gillies, president of the Nova Scotia Southern Railway, had anything to do with it.
You reassure him that everyone else is treated equally as a suspect, but that he must clarify his private meeting with Mr. DeWitt if he wishes to be exonerated. He gives in.
If you must know, I was warning him about that con artist, that charlatan over there. He was taking James' attention away from actual business with the railroad, towards nonsensical and fantastical dreams. I don't believe for one second that Mr. Brisebois, if that even is his real name, has any value except in selling wild, exciting ideas to people with money. That, detective, is why James returned in such a state. I was trying to knock some sense into him, but someone else took it even further. I'm more than willing to knock a little sense into a man, but I would never kill him.
You thank Mr. Gillies for his time, and you move on with the investigation. You believe what he said, and you go talk to Mr. Brisebois to collect some more information. You already know about his business plans with Mr. DeWitt, so you get straight to the point and ask him if he actually intended on going through with them, and he's more than willing to provide a flamboyant answer.
How dare you? I'm a most respected businessman. If only my colleagues from around the world were here, from Boston, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Montreal, even Paris, they'd laugh at you. I've never done something as close as to what you're suggesting. I'm an honest man.
As he boisterously pronounces the word honest and uses his arms in gesturing, nothing other than the ace of spades falls out of his left sleeve.
I knew it. You cheat, you con, imposter. I knew I smelled vermin the second I met you.
Oh, all right. I don't know anyone in Boston, except for a few other inmates.
Other inmates? How did James let a criminal into his life? Oh, dear.
I had no business plans, only to get the money and run. He was only supposed to be a few $1,000s short, a mere dent in his fortune. This is how I make a living. Half of what I do is fake. It's all for show. To impress people. To confuse them. To sell them on some big idea. Now I actually feel bad for the guy.
You've dealt with his kind before. Cheaters, liars, scoundrels, but not always murderers. You've asked all the questions you need to ask, and you need more information. You go to ask Wolf, the butler, about the brandy. Oh, this is a tragedy. A most terrible tragedy, if I might say. There was only one bottle as far as I could tell. There are usually more supplies in the summer, but this bottle was the only bottle. A special bottle, if I might add. Mr. DeWitt saved it especially for this poker match. All the brandy glasses were the same, so there would have been no way of calculating which one Mr. DeWitt would have received. If I might say, sir, forgive me, but the whole bottle must have been poisoned. Why didn't you think of this before? You immediately asked to check the bottle. Wolf hastily walks over to the liquor cabinet, removes the fancy bottle of brandy and hands it to you. You remove the lid and put your nose up to the bottle. It's strong. It's very strong. But after the shock, you pick up a faint odor beneath the brandy. Bitter almonds. The smell of cyanide. How does this make sense? Who would want to poison James DeWitt? How was Mr. Brisebois not poisoned too?
Half of what I do is fake. It's all for show.
What if Mr. Brisebois never took a sip? What if, just like you, he likes to keep his mind sharp, albeit for slightly different reasons? He should be dead too. Mr. Brisebois simply put the cup up to his mouth for show. Who else drank brandy? Thomas ordered brandy, but you don't recall him drinking any. He was so keen on ordering it, but he didn't drink any. He was the first to order. but he didn't drink any. Don't let Father know we have whiskey. You know how he is at these things. He can't refuse a drink. Tommy. It couldn't be. He ordered brandy, knowing that his father couldn't resist ordering one too. His father drank it while he left his cup alone, knowing that at any minute, his father would collapse. Brisebois just put himself in danger without knowing it. But Tommy was so innocent. But perhaps a little too innocent. You re-enter the card room and ask Tommy a question. You know that if he's the murderer, he's probably not an experienced criminal, and he could give more information than asked of him. In your question, all you ask is why he did it. Not why he killed his father, nor why he murdered someone, just why he did it. As you ask the question, Tommy begins to slowly pace to his left, as if contemplating the question. Then out of nowhere, he quickly breaks right for the door. You get your hands on his coat for a brief second, but he slithers by. He makes it closer to the door when James Jr. steps in front of his path and slugs his younger brother right in the schnozzle. And Thomas DeWitt falls to the floor. Oh. Anyone would moan with an injury like that, but you can't help detecting a hint of spoiled brat beneath his discomfort. You begin to ask him why, but his brother beats you to it. Why, Tom? Why? What could possibly be going through your mind? Don't you see? You've always been the next businessman in the family, and that's what made you Father's favorite. You were the one he taught all the tricks of the trade, while I was just the younger brother expected to frolic about in mountains of money. Oh, I hated it when you and Father had one of your secret meetings where you discussed the company. Were you too blind to see it? I was part of that plan of your competitors to bring you and Father down. I wanted to see you suffer. Once that failed, I planned the perfect time for this to happen. A bottle of brandy I knew Father couldn't resist trying. Angry business partners at each other's throats. An island where there are no people, no police. Who could ask for better conditions? Then you, Jimmy, would be all that is left between me and fortune. But Father invited this rotten detective at the last minute and spoiled my plans. Oh, and detective, I wasn't lying when I said I was interested in your methods. I just never said from which point of view. You'll hang for this, you know. You'll hang for this. I have ways, brother. I have ways. You're no brother of mine. Detective, if you agree, I think it's best to detain him here for the night, and in the morning, if the weather improves, we shall move him into proper custody. You agree. It's far too dangerous for any ships to come in these conditions. You've caught your killer, but it looks like you'll have to stay the night. You'll have to stay vigilant. Very vigilant. Thomas DeWitt might just be a kid, but he's been part of conspiracy and most recently, murder, and he's not to be underestimated.